Hi, my name's Ashley and I thought I'd talk about the first 5 fiction books that aren't YA that I read this year. The first book I read this year was On My Pilgrims by Jenni Fagan. This is set in a sort of apocalyptic future in which climate change has caught up with us. The ice caps have all but disappeared, salinity levels in the oceans are rising, and ocean drifts are slowing. Basically, another ice age has descended. But this isn't a save the world, action-packed, sort of fast-paced novel. It's more of a slow-paced character study set on the fringes of society in a caravan park at the foot of mountains in Scotland. It's beautifully written. I actually ended up spending a few hours poring over just the prologue, kind of trying to puzzle out the imagery and the language, because she uses a lot of Scottish words to describe the landscape and the climate. So they're both kind of Gaelic words and regional words, as well as kind of more geographical, technical terms. So it paints this really specific, isolating picture. I speak Gaeilge, as in Irish, so I was able to kind of figure out some of it, and I also quite like geography, so some more of it was kind of familiar to me, but for a lot of it I ended up just trawling through the internet, looking at like sites and forums on Scottish terminology involving snow and ice. So the plot. While there are other people in the periphery, like the main character's neighbours in the caravan park, the book mostly follows 3 main characters. There's Dylan, a man whose mother and grandmother have just passed away and whose family's art house cinema in London has just gone out of business. He's come to Clachan Falls, where this book is set, because his mother bought a caravan there and it's where his grandmother is originally from. The other 2 characters are 12-year-old Stella and her mother Constance. Stella is a trans girl who's lived in Clachan Falls for her whole life, and Constance is kind of a survivalist who has 2 lovers. All 3 characters are kind of isolated by the people around them. Dylan because he's an outsider, Stella because of her gender identity, and Constance because of her sexual and romantic choices. I love this book, but I would attach a trigger warning for trans bashing. So bear that in mind when you're reading it. Because I love the On My Pilgrim so much, after finishing it I immediately got my hands on Jenni Fagan's debut novel, which is the Panopticon. This book follows Anais, who's a 15-year-old girl who's kind of been in the foster care system for her whole life. And the novel opens with her in the back of a police car being brought to this institution called the Panopticon. She's covered in blood and she doesn't remember what happened. But the novel doesn't really focus on whether or not she did or didn't commit the crime she's been suspected of, which is of killing a police officer. Instead, it kind of explores the care system in the UK and how it affects Anais to have been let down basically by every single adult that she's known, and also to be labelled as a chronic offender. She's angry and she's scared and she's kind of been given up as a lost case. This book explores trauma and friendship, I would say, primarily. Anais has been involved with both girls and boys, but she doesn't actually take on any labels in the book as far as I can remember. And I really loved the depiction of being bi in this book. I'm using the word bi here as an umbrella term rather than a specific ID, because I don't think Anais uses any specific terms. Jenni Fagan herself has talked about being bisexual, and I think it was just so wonderful to read an Own Voices book with a bi protagonist. And there are also other LGBT plus characters in the book. Panopticon does deal with a lot of themes that could be quite triggering though, so the foster care system and institutionalization, as well as sexual abuse. There's a scene in this in which a peripheral character misgenders and sexually assaults her partner, who's a trans woman. Her partner is asleep and the assaulter does it with a casualness that's pretty brutal. It's quite a short scene, so if you wanted to, you could just skip it, but just so people are aware that is in there. The third novel I read was Becky Chambers' debut novel, The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, and this was another book that I absolutely loved. It's set in space, and if you love the show Firefly but wish it was a bit more queer, then this is probably the book for you. It's a sci-fi book in which our main character Rosemary joins the Wayfarer, a small patchwork ship that travels through hyperspace to connect planets that are far away from each other. Rosemary is a human girl with kind of an in-depth academic knowledge of linguistics, but she's rarely met any non-humans. While this is a space travel story, it's more focused on character and plot, and really focuses on themes of diversity and cultural difference. For most of the story, the crew are alone in space, although they do dock on other planets occasionally. This book is such an interesting exploration of what it means to live among people whose cultures are different from yours, and the isolation that comes with constantly having to navigate others and check yourself, I guess. One of the members of the crew, Sissix, is of a species that kind of understands love and sex and affection in a way that's completely different from the other members of the crew. For her, monogamy is kind of absurd and it's not natural. And the novel really explores how that affects her. There's quite a lot in this book, but I don't want to give too much away. So I'll just say that this is really, really fun and it explores diversity. After which I read yet another debut novel, which is Under the Udala Trees by Chinelo Okparanta. This novel takes place in Nigeria in 1968 during the Biafran War, and it follows Ijeoma, who's 13 years old. It explores war and family, religious and cultural differences, and also what it's like for Ijeoma to be gay in a place and time that views homosexuality as an abomination. And that's the word that's used again and again. This book is beautifully written, and while this is a debut novel, Okparanta has also published a collection of short stories, which I'm hoping to read at some point. So Ijeoma exists in a world in which all of her familiar structures are taken from her one by one. So first, the safety of peacetime, the routine of school, the net provided by her father's faith in life, basically. Then she loses her father and her mother sends her away to live with relative strangers. For a lot of the novel, Ijeoma is forced to uphold the values of others. In one scene, her mother punishes her for giving water to a thirsty soldier because Ijeoma had been forbidden from doing so. She lives in a world that's tearing itself apart and is told that she shouldn't do anything to alleviate the suffering of those around her. One day she disobeys this when a girl her own age follows her back to the home of the couple her mother has sent her to, and the two girls fall in love. The one thing that I wish had been different about this novel is that I wish that Okparanta maybe had focused more on the girls that Ijeoma falls in love with and their relationships. There were really very few scenes in this in which you saw her communicating with the women who she falls in love with. Other than that, I really enjoyed this novel though. It's really excellent and it breaks taboos with grace. So the fifth book that I read and the last book that I'm going to talk about in this video was similarly an attempt to break silence around woman-to-woman love, and was actually banned in the UK after an obscenity trial because it was a plea for the recognition and toleration of lesbianism. It's The Well of Loneliness by Radclyffe. So I have a lot to say about this book, and I was thinking of maybe making a video comparing it to Virginia Woolf's Orlando, which was also published in the same year, which is 1928. So this book is really interesting and I really enjoyed it while reading it, but I think I had some problems with the message at the heart of this book. So in this book, homosexuality is referred to as inversion, which was a scientific theory that was quite popular when this book was written and also in the 50s and 60s. This scientific theory basically held that same-sex attraction occurred when a feminine soul was born in a masculine body or vice versa. So obviously we've kind of done away with that theory, but I think it's kind of interesting to discuss anyway. I think at the root of it is this kind of heteronormativity, because underlying it is this assumption that a woman could never feel sexual desire towards another woman nor a man towards another man. Rather, a person's soul has to be inverted to explain it. As well as being quite absurd for a lot of reasons. Under the theory, bisexuality doesn't exist. Instead, they're just kind of people who have the tragic fate of having fallen in love with an quote-unquote invert, which happens in this book. Similarly, it's kind of unable to account for a lot of trans people's experiences, including gay and lesbian trans people and non-binary people. But this was a theory that Hall herself subscribed to, and throughout the book it's presented as fact. I don't think it was really the use of the theory of inversion that bothered me in this book. I think it was more the sort of shame that was woven into the fabric of the story. Inversion is kind of depicted as this tragedy, not just because of societal prejudice, but also because it's seen as kind of an inversion of the natural order. There are a lot of sort of passages in it in which it's kind of a plea to heterosexual people to recognize the plight and tragic fate of the invert. And after a while it really starts to bother you, especially the way the trajectory of this story runs. Despite all of that, I did really enjoy this book. Although I would say that the introduction to this particular edition of the book really kind of dismissed any literary merit that the book might have. But I thought it was quite well written, and I probably just wouldn't read. It's quite a short introduction, but I definitely wouldn't read it before reading the book. And I might not bother afterwards either, to be perfectly honest. So I haven't really talked about the plot of this book, but I feel like I've gone on quite a bit, so I'm just going to keep this real brief. So the book follows Stephen Gordon, who from the moment she's born is kind of deemed different from those around her, and never has a character being referred to more frequently or universally as queer than in this book. For the first few chapters, I feel like almost every few sentences, either the narrator or her parents or the servants in the house or people in the neighborhood are just constantly calling Stephen queer. So as she grows up, she kind of struggles with the constraints placed upon her because of her gender, and then ends up falling in love with women around her, and for which she's eventually banished from her house after she's quite brutally outed. So I think it's definitely a really interesting book to read, even just for sort of like historical depictions of lesbianism. But I would say maybe take it with a pinch of salt. So those are the first 5 fiction books that I read this year, and if any of you have read them, please let me know in the comments because I'd really love to know what you thought. Until next time.